Hello, and welcome back. I'm glad you're here tonight. Tonight, we're going somewhere quiet and familiar. Beneath the roots of a great old tree, into a warm burrow where Theodore, Eleanor, Mabel, Finn, and little Pippa are settling into an ordinary autumn evening. There's jam cooling on the shelf, a fire glowing softly, and supper waiting on the table. Whatever the day was, let it sit where it is. We're not going back to it tonight. Notice where you are. Your head is on the pillow, your body supported, and comfortable enough is exactly where we start. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Not forced shut, just resting. Let your face ease. Forehead, jaw, and the space around your eyes. Let your neck rest back into the pillow. Think of that old tree now, its roots deep and wide beneath the ground. Down there, nothing rushes. The air is cool and still, smelling faintly of earth and autumn. Let your shoulders drop and feel the width of your back against the mattress. Let your arms lie where they are, your hands loosening in their own time. Beneath the roots there is a burrow, warm and low-ceilinged, with root walls, lantern light, wood smoke, bramble jam, and 5 chairs around a table. Your legs are heavy now. Your feet can be still. Let the whole body sink. Outside, the woodland is settling into night. The birds have gone quiet. The wind has dropped, and the lantern above the burrow door burns steadily. Theodore is by the fire. Eleanor is nearby. The jam jars are cooling on the shelf, and the quiet Warrenfield evening is ready to begin. Very gently now. We'll go and see how it starts. Where's Finn? The fire had burned low in the night. It did that sometimes when the autumn crept in and the temperature dropped faster than expected. Theodore had learned over many years of early mornings to read the burrow by feel before he even opened his eyes. The particular quality of the cold this morning told him the embers needed attention. He eased himself out from under the quilt without disturbing Eleanor, which was something he had also learned over many years. She slept on her side, facing the wall, one ear folded against the pillow. He watched her for a moment in the dark, then pulled on his cardigan and padded through to the main room in his socks. The burrow was quiet, in the way that only very early mornings are quiet. Not empty, never empty, with 5 of them living here, but still, resting. The root walls held the darkness softly, and the only light came from the faint orange glow at the heart of the fireplace, where a few embers were still doing their best. Theodore crouched in front of them and worked slowly. A little breath, a few small pieces of kindling laid with care. He had done this so many times that his hands knew what to do without being told. He watched the kindling catch, then added 2 larger pieces of wood, and sat back on his heels and waited. Outside, the woodland was beginning. He could hear it through the burrow's thick earthen walls. Not clearly, but as a kind of presence. A wood pigeon somewhere. The very first suggestion of wind in the upper branches. Autumn had arrived properly this week. You could feel it in the ground, in the air, in the particular smell that came through the burrow door when you opened it in the morning. Something woodsy and cold and faintly sweet, like the earth was beginning to turn inward. Theodore filled the kettle from the stone jug on the shelf and set it over the fire. Then he sat in his chair, the one on the left of the fireplace, the one that had held the shape of him for so long it was practically a portrait. And he waited for the water to boil and for the morning to begin. He was on his 2nd cup when Eleanor appeared. She came through the bedroom doorway with her shawl pulled around her shoulders and her ears slightly flattened in the way they always were before she was fully awake. Her eyes found the fire first, then the kettle, then Theodore. "You're up early," she said. Fire needed seeing to. She made a small sound that meant she understood and went to the shelf for her own cup. Theodore watched her move around the kitchen end of the main room, unhurried, familiar, knowing exactly where everything was without looking. She lifted the lid on the pot she had left soaking overnight, gave it a stir, replaced the lid. She ran her hand along the row of herb jars on the shelf, checking something in her own private inventory. "Bramble jam today," she said, not really to Theodore, more to herself. "I'll need more brambles then. I used the last of yesterday's batch. There are plenty still on the lower path. Finn will go if you ask him. Finn will go whether I ask him or not." Eleanor smiled at that, her back still to him. She poured her tea and came to sit in the other chair, the one on the right, and they sat together in front of the fire while the burrow warmed around them and the morning came on slowly outside. This was Theodore's favorite part of any day. He wouldn't have said so out loud. It wasn't the sort of thing he said out loud. But it was true. These quiet minutes before the children woke, when it was just the 2 of them and the fire and the kettle, and the particular piece of a home that was sleeping. He had sat in this chair beside this woman for more years than he sometimes remembered, and he still felt, on mornings like this, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The first sound from the back of the burrow was Mabel's door. She was always next. She appeared in the doorway, already dressed, her journal tucked under her arm, her dark eyes moving around the room in that quiet, observant way she had. She looked like Eleanor when she did that, taking stock, noticing things. "Morning," she said. "Morning, love," said Eleanor. "Tea's hot." Mabel poured herself a cup and leaned against the kitchen shelf, opening her journal to yesterday's page and reading back over something she had written. She had been keeping journals since she was old enough to hold a pen properly. There were 7 of them now, lined up on the shelf in her room. Theodore had never read them, and never would. They were hers, but he liked knowing they existed. Pippa was next, though she didn't so much appear as arrive. There was a sound of small feet on the earthen floor of the corridor. A pause, and then she came around the doorframe at speed, Bun trailing from one fist, her ears askew from sleep. She crossed the room without looking at anyone, and climbed directly into Theodore's lap, turned herself around twice like a small animal making a nest, and settled. "Morning, little one," Theodore said. Pippa said nothing. She pressed her nose against his cardigan and closed her eyes again. Bun dangled from her hand. Eleanor watched this with the expression she always had when she watched Theodore with Pippa. Something warm and private that she didn't bother to hide. Then Finn arrived. The door to his room opened with more force than was necessary, and he came down the corridor at a pace that suggested he had somewhere important to be, which he almost certainly did not. He was wearing his exploration jacket already, the brown one with the deep pockets, and his ears were up and alert in a way that meant his mind was already outside. He caught his hip on the corner of the table as he came into the main room. "Ow," he said. "Good morning, Finn," said Eleanor. "Mornin'." He rubbed his hip and went straight to the bread on the shelf, cutting himself a thick slice without being asked. "Is there butter?" "There is." "Sit down." He sat, but in the way that suggested sitting was a temporary arrangement. He ate quickly, looking at nothing in particular, which meant he was thinking. Theodore recognized the look. He had seen it on Finn's face since Finn was old enough to have thoughts worth thinking about. "Where are you off to?" Theodore asked. "Just out. Down the bramble path, maybe. I want to check something on my map." "What are you checking?" Finn chewed his bread. "There's a section near the eastern end where I think the path splits, and I've only drawn one fork. I want to see if there's another one." Theodore nodded. This was a perfectly reasonable thing to want to know. "Not too far," Eleanor said from her chair by the fire. "I know." "Finn." "I know, Mom. Not too far." He said it the way he always said it, which was with complete sincerity and absolutely no guarantee of follow-through. Eleanor knew this. Theodore knew this. Mabel, who had not looked up from her journal, knew this. Pippa had fallen back to sleep in Theodore's lap. Breakfast settled into its natural rhythm. Eleanor made porridge, and they all sat around the table. Pippa in her small chair with the carved legs that Theodore had made when she was born. Bun propped against the edge of the bowl. The fire was going properly now, and the burrow had reached that particular temperature that felt like being held. Warm enough to make you slow. Warm enough to make you not want to move. Outside, the morning was getting on. The wood pigeon had been joined by others. The wind had picked up slightly in the trees above them. You could feel it as a faint vibration through the roots in the ceiling. A gentle creaking that was as familiar to all of them as their own breathing. Mabel asked Eleanor about the jam making. Eleanor explained the process. The brambles needed to be picked before the afternoon. The sugar measured carefully. The jars sterilized. Mabel listened and asked questions. Not because she intended to help necessarily, but because she was interested in how things worked. She was like that with most things. Finn ate a second bowl of porridge, and then a third piece of bread, and then announced he was going. "Take your coat," Eleanor said. "I've got my jacket." "Your coat, Finn. It's cold out." He took his coat. He also took his map, folded into the inside pocket of his exploration jacket, and his small pencil, and an apple from the bowl on the shelf, which he bit into immediately on his way out the door. The burrow door opened, and a breath of cold autumn air came in, sharp and clean, and smelling of leaves and earth. And then the door closed, and he was gone. The burrow felt, as it always did when Finn left, slightly quieter than it had any right to be. Theodore went up to the garden after breakfast. The entrance to the burrow opened onto a small sheltered area at the base of the great tree. And from there, a short path led up through the roots to the garden above. A modest patch of turned earth that Theodore had been tending for as long as they had lived here. In summer, it grew vegetables. In autumn, he was putting it to bed, clearing the last of the season's growth, turning the soil, planting the things that would overwinter and be ready in spring. He stood at the top of the path for a moment before he started work, just looking. The woodland in early autumn was something he never quite got used to, no matter how many times he had seen it. The light was different to any other season, lower, more golden, coming through the trees at an angle that made everything look slightly more itself than usual. The oak leaves were turning at the edges. The birch had gone almost entirely yellow. Somewhere further in, where the beeches were, there would be copper and rust, and a deep reddish brown that had no proper name. The air was cold enough to see his breath. He picked up his fork and started work. There was something about digging that Theodore found deeply settling. It required just enough attention to keep the mind from wandering too far, and not so much that you couldn't think. He worked steadily, turning the soil in long rows, breaking up the clumps, clearing the dead stems of the summer's bean plants. A robin appeared on the fence post at the edge of the garden and watched him with the professional interest that robins always showed when soil was being turned. He worked for a long time without thinking about anything in particular. Below, in the burrow, Eleanor was making jam. The brambles Theodore had brought home yesterday were in the pot with the sugar, and the smell of them cooking was extraordinary. Sweet and dark and slightly sharp, filling every corner of the burrow with something that felt like the very essence of autumn. Eleanor stirred slowly and steadily, watching the surface of the jam for the signs she knew to look for. Pippa sat on the moss floor nearby, engaged in a project of her own. She had found a collection of acorn caps. She had been gathering them for weeks, carrying them home in her small fists, and she was sorting them by size with great concentration. Bun sat propped against the leg of the table, observing. Eleanor watched her daughter between stirs. Pippa was at the age where everything was interesting, and nothing needed explaining. She didn't ask why the acorn caps needed sorting. They simply did. She picked each one up, turned it over, considered it, and placed it in one of two piles, according to a system that Eleanor couldn't quite work out, but that clearly made complete sense to Pippa. "That one's a big one," Eleanor said, nodding at a particularly large cap. Pippa looked at it, looked at Eleanor, placed it very deliberately in the left pile. "Right," said Eleanor. "Good choice." She turned back to the jam. Mabel had taken her journal outside. She sat on the wide, flat root that curved out from the base of the tree, just to the left of the burrow entrance. Her spot. The one she had claimed years ago, and that the rest of the family respected without discussion. She had her knees drawn up and her journal open against them, and she was drawing. What she was drawing was the view directly in front of her, the path leading away through the trees, the way the light fell through the canopy in long, pale shafts, the spider's web strung between two low branches that was still holding the morning's dew in a string of tiny, perfect drops. She drew slowly and carefully, the way she did everything. She was not a fast person. She had never been a fast person. Finn had enough speed for both of them, she had always thought, and she was happy to let him have it. The woodland was peaceful this morning. A squirrel moved through the branches above her. She could hear it, but not see it. Just the small sounds of movement and the occasional shower of leaf fragments drifting down. The wind came and went in the upper canopy. Below, at ground level, everything was still. She finished the spider's web and started on the trees. She was thinking as she drew about nothing very specific. This was one of the things she liked about drawing. It gave her mind somewhere to rest. She didn't have to think about anything. She just had to look, and then make her hand do what her eyes were telling it. She drew for a long time. Finn had been walking for 40 minutes before he found the fork. He had known it was there. He had felt it on his last visit. A sense that the path was doing something just beyond where he had stopped. A slight widening of the track that suggested a choice coming. And here it was. The bramble path continued straight ahead as he had mapped it, but to the right, half hidden by a curtain of old bramble that had grown across the entrance over the summer, there was another way. He pushed the bramble aside carefully. It caught on his coat sleeve and he had to work it free, and stepped through. The new path was narrower than the main one, and less walked. The ground was softer here, more leaf litter, less bare earth. The trees were closer together, and the light came through in smaller pieces. It felt like a different kind of woodland to the path he knew. Older somehow, or just less visited. He took out his map and his pencil and marked the fork. Then he followed the new path. It wound between the trees in a way that felt almost deliberate, as though it had been made by something that knew where it was going. Finn followed it with his eyes, moving between the ground ahead and the map in his hands, adding the new route in careful pencil lines, noting the landmarks: a fallen silver birch, a cluster of particularly large toadstools in a ring, a place where the path dipped down into a small hollow and then climbed back up. At the bottom of the hollow, he found the stream. It was narrow. He could have stepped across it easily, and very clear. The water moved quickly over a bed of small stones, making a sound that was somewhere between a trickle and a rush. He crouched at the edge and looked into it. He could see the bottom perfectly. A few dead leaves moved along the current, spinning slowly. He sat back on his heels and looked around. He had never been here before. He was fairly certain no one from the burrow had been here before, or at least not recently. The ground around the stream was undisturbed. No footprints, no broken stems, nothing to suggest recent visitors. It felt like a place that had been quietly getting on with being itself for a very long time, without anyone watching. He marked the stream on his map. He sat beside it for a while, listening to it. Then he looked up and noticed the light. It was lower than it should have been. Not dark, not even close to dark, but the particular quality of the light through the trees had shifted in the way it did in the mid-afternoon, when the sun had moved past its highest point and was beginning its slow descent. He looked at the light, and then at his map, and then at the light again. He had been out longer than he thought. He stood up, folded his map, and looked back the way he had come. The new path wound back up out of the hollow and disappeared between the trees. He could follow it back to the fork, and then back along the bramble path to home. He knew that. He had the map. He started walking. Back at the burrow, Eleanor had taken the jam off the heat and set the jars to cool on the shelf. The smell of them was still thick in the air, warm and sweet and dark. She had washed the pot and tidied the kitchen end of the room, and was now sitting in her chair with Pippa in her lap, reading to her from the small picture book that Pippa had brought her, which was about a family of mice who lived in a mill and had various gentle adventures. Pippa was not really listening to the story. She was looking at the pictures with great seriousness. occasionally pointing at something and waiting for Eleanor to name it. "Duck," Eleanor said. Pippa looked at the duck, nodded, turned the page. "Wheel," Eleanor said. "That's the mill wheel." Pippa considered the mill wheel. Mabel came in from outside, her journal under her arm, her ears pink from the cold. She went straight to the kettle and put it on, then stood with her back to the fire, warming herself. "Where's Dad?" she asked. "Still in the garden, I think." As if on cue, they heard Theodore's boots on the path outside, and then the burrow door opened, and he came in, bringing the cold with him. He hung his coat on the hook and came to the fire, holding his hands out to it. "Getting cold," he said. "I know. Tea's just going on." He looked around the room, at Eleanor and Pippa with the book, at Mabel by the fire, at the table where 4 chairs were pulled in and one was pushed out at an angle, the way Finn always left it. "Finn not back?" he said. "Not yet," Eleanor said. She said it evenly, without concern in her voice, though she glanced at the door as she said it. Theodore looked at the door too. Then he looked at the window, the small round window set into the root wall that looked out at the base of the tree. The light outside was definitely afternoon light now, the golden kind. "I'll give him a bit," he said. "He'll be on that path," Mabel said. "You know what he's like when he's mapping something." "I know," said Theodore. He sat in his chair. Eleanor poured the tea. Pippa turned another page of the book and pointed at something. "Boat," Eleanor said. They sat. The fire crackled. The jam jars cooled on the shelf. Outside, the afternoon light moved slowly through the trees. After a while, Theodore set down his cup, stood up, and went to get his coat. "I'll go and find him," he said. Eleanor looked up at him. "Take your walking stick." He took his walking stick. The bramble path in the afternoon was a different thing to the bramble path in the morning. The light came through at a lower angle and caught the remaining berries on the brambles, the ones Finn hadn't eaten, the ones too high to reach, and made them look almost luminous, deep red and black against the darkening green of the leaves. Theodore walked steadily, not fast. He had never been a fast walker. He called Finn's name every so often, not urgently, just clearly, letting his voice carry through the trees. "Finn." The woodland absorbed the sound and gave nothing back. He walked on. He knew this path well. He had walked it hundreds of times over the years, in every season, in every kind of weather. He knew where it widened and where it narrowed, where the roots crossed the track and where the ground dipped. He knew the old oak that leaned out over the path at the halfway point, the one with the hollow at its base, where Finn had once convinced himself a fox lived. He stopped at the hollow and looked at it. Empty, as always. He walked on. The light was still good. There was plenty of afternoon left, but it had that quality now of beginning to think about evening. The shadows were longer. The birds had gone quieter. The woodland was doing what it did in the hour before dusk, which was to settle into itself, to become more still and more present at the same time. Finn. And then, from somewhere ahead and slightly to the right, a sound, not a voice, just movement. The sound of something pushing through undergrowth, the snap of a small branch. Theodore stopped and listened. It came again, closer, and then Finn appeared from between the trees, pushing aside a curtain of old bramble with one arm. His coat caught on a thorn, his map sticking out of his jacket pocket, his ears up and alert. He stopped when he saw Theodore. They looked at each other. "Hi, Dad," Finn said. "Hello," said Theodore. A pause. "I found a new path," Finn said, "and a stream. I've added them to the map." Theodore looked at him for a moment, at the mud on his boots and the bramble scratch on the back of his hand, and the apple core sticking out of his coat pocket, at the map, which he could see even from here, had new pencil lines on it. "Show me on the way back," Theodore said. They fell into step together on the bramble path, heading home. Finn took out the map and held it between them as they walked, pointing out the fork, the new path, the hollow, the stream. Theodore looked at it properly, asking questions, following the pencil lines with his finger. "It's a good find," he said. "I think it might connect to the eastern meadow eventually," Finn said. "If the path keeps going in that direction. I'd need to follow it further to know." "We could do that," Theodore said. "Another day. Together." Finn looked at him sideways. "Yeah? If you want." "Yeah," Finn said. "I'd like that." They walked in silence for a bit. The path was familiar under their feet. The brambles on either side were heavy with the last of the season's berries, and the smell of them was rich and slightly fermented in the cool air. "Sorry," Finn said, "for being late back. You weren't to know how long the new path would take. Mum will say I should have turned back sooner." "She'll be right," Theodore said. "But she'll also be glad you're home." Finn nodded. He folded his map and put it back in his pocket. Ahead, through the trees, the path was beginning to open out toward the familiar ground near the burrow. And then, before they could even see it, they could smell it. Wood smoke. And something else underneath it, warm and sweet. "Is that jam?" Finn said. "Bramble," Theodore said. "Your mother's been making it all afternoon." Finn was quiet for a moment. "I'm quite hungry, actually." "I imagine you are." The burrow came into view through the trees. The great tree. The lantern above the door, already lit against the coming dusk. The soft glow of firelight in the small round window. It looked, as it always looked to Theodore when he came home to it, like the most solid and reliable thing in the world. The door opened before they reached it. Mabel was standing in the doorway, and she looked at them both with an expression that was trying very hard to be casual and not quite managing it. "Supper's nearly ready," she said. "Good," said Finn. "I'm starving." "You're always starving." "That's not true." "It is completely true." He pushed past her into the burrow, and she let him. And Theodore caught the look on her face as she stepped aside. The quick, private relief of it, before she arranged her expression back into something more sisterly and followed him in. Inside, the burrow was everything it always was in the evening. The fire was built up high, and the light from it moved on the root walls in the way that firelight does. Warm and shifting and alive. The jam jars on the shelf caught the light and glowed amber. The table was set. 5 places, 5 clay bowls. The bread on the board in the middle, the butter beside it. Eleanor was at the stove. She turned when they came in, and her eyes went straight to Finn, and she looked at him for just a moment, taking him in, checking him over in the way that mothers do, the quick inventory that happens before anything is said. "Wash your hands," she said, "both of you." "I'm not even dirty," Theodore said. "You've been in the garden all morning and on the path all afternoon. Wash your hands." Theodore washed his hands. Finn washed his hands and then sat down at the table and immediately reached for the bread. "Wait," Eleanor said, without turning around. He put the bread down. Pippa was already in her chair, Bun on the table beside her bowl, both of them apparently ready for supper. She looked at Finn when he sat down, and then looked at Bun, and then looked back at Finn, as though making an introduction. "Hello, Bun," Finn said seriously. Pippa seemed satisfied with this. Eleanor brought the pot to the table. A thick vegetable stew. The smell of it filling the room, and they all sat, and she ladled it out, and Theodore cut the bread. And for a few minutes there was just the sound of that, of the family settling into the meal, of spoons and bowls and the fire and the wind in the trees above them. Finn ate quickly, as he always did, and then more slowly as the hunger eased. He told the table about the new path and the stream, and Mabel asked questions about the stream. How wide? How deep? What color were the stones? And Finn answered them with the seriousness of someone reporting a genuine discovery, which he was. Eleanor listened and said very little. But at one point, when Finn was describing the hollow where the path dipped down, she reached across and straightened the collar of his exploration jacket, which had been folded under itself since he came in. And Finn didn't notice, or didn't say anything if he did. Theodore noticed. Pippa ate about half her stew, and then stopped eating and started arranging the vegetables in her bowl into a pattern that made sense to her. Then she stopped doing that and leaned her head against Eleanor's arm. Then she was asleep. It happened that quickly, the way it always did with Pippa. One moment present, the next gone. Eleanor looked down at her and smiled and kept eating with her other hand. "I'll take her," Theodore said when he had finished. He lifted Pippa carefully. She was warm and completely limp in the way that sleeping children are, utterly trusting, and carried her through to her room. He laid her in her bed and pulled the quilt up and tucked Bun in beside her, because Bun had been left on the table and Pippa would want her when she woke. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her. Then he went back to the table, where Mabel was telling Finn that his map would be better if he used a proper scale. And Finn was explaining that he did use a proper scale, and Mabel was saying that she didn't think he did. And Eleanor was clearing the bowls with the expression of someone who had heard this particular conversation before and expected to hear it many times more. Theodore sat down. Eleanor put a cup of chamomile tea in front of him without being asked. He wrapped his hands around it and looked at his family. Mabel and Finn still going back and forth about the map. Eleanor moving between the table and the shelf. The fire doing what it always did. The jam jars glowing on the shelf. The lantern above the door burning steadily outside in the dark. After a while, Mabel went to her room. Then Finn, who had been yawning for 20 minutes but refusing to acknowledge it, finally gave in and said good night and disappeared down the corridor. Eleanor banked the fire for the night, a careful, practiced routine, the same every evening. Theodore watched her do it. Then they sat together in their chairs, as they had that morning, as they did every evening. In the quiet that came when the children were in bed, and the burrow was theirs again. Not for long. They were both tired. But for a little while. The fire settled. The wood shifted. Outside, the woodland was fully dark now, and fully quiet. And the lantern above the burrow door burned on in the dark the way it always did. The way it would all night. A small, steady light at the base of the great tree. Eleanor finished her tea. "Bed," she said. "Yes," said Theodore, and the burrow was still.